Harmony Creek Courthouse, October 14, 2024. A woman stands before a heavy oak door, her hand trembling against the cold brass handle. That woman is me, Gloria Lawson, and on the other side of this wood, my entire family is waiting to ambush me. They are dressed in their Sunday best, armed with high-priced lawyers and a lie designed to strip me of my freedom. They think I am the same quiet girl they overlooked for 20 years, the one who would sign away her future just to keep the peace. They are wrong. I am holding a briefcase full of secrets they thought were buried, and I am about to teach them the cost of betrayal. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. My hand hovered over the brass handle of the heavy oak courtroom door, my palms slick with a cold, nervous sweat. I paused for a second, catching my reflection in the dark wood, a 27-year-old woman in a charcoal suit I'd bought at a thrift store for $12. I had spent an hour steaming the wrinkles out of the cheap polyester the night before, desperate to look professional, desperate to hide the fact that I was terrified. It felt less like I was walking into a court of law, and more like I was stepping into an ambush. I took a breath that rattled in my chest, pushed the door open, and stepped into the chilled, antiseptic air of the courtroom. They were already seated, the Lawson family looking like a portrait of American success. My mother, Elaine, wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my car, her hair coiffed into a rigid, unmoving helmet of silver. My father, Victor, sat like a stone statue in his tailored navy suit, his jaw muscles working tight, rhythmic pulses that betrayed his fury. And then there was Cody. My younger brother sat next to their high-priced attorney, leaning back with an arrogant ease that made my stomach turn. He was wearing a suit I knew my parents had bought him, and when he saw me, a smirk curled the corner of his mouth. I walked to the lone table on the other side of the aisle, the heels of my scuffed shoes clicking loudly in the silence. My mother rolled her eyes as I passed, a gesture so familiar it made me feel 6 years old again. My father didn't even look at me. He just stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench as if acknowledging my existence would cost him something. I felt the sting of it hot and sharp. My own parents looked at me like I was the problem, like they hadn't just tried to erase me from my own life. I set my worn faux leather briefcase on the table, knowing the judge hadn't entered yet, and braced myself against the wood. The people who raised me were here to threaten everything I had left, and the war was about to begin. To understand why I'm here staring down my own flesh and blood in a court of law, you need to know who I was before they ambushed me. I grew up in Harmony Creek, a small town, where the church steeple was the highest point in the skyline, and Friday night football was the only religion that truly mattered. Everyone knew everyone, which meant everyone knew the Lawsons. We were the picture-perfect family, at least from the outside. But inside that house, affection and resources were a finite currency, and the exchange rate was rigged. Cody was the golden boy, the star quarterback with the winning smile. I was Gloria, the quiet girl in the background. When Cody turned 16, my parents surprised him with a brand new red pickup truck with a bow on the hood. When I turned 16, they told me that if I wanted to drive, I'd better pick up extra shifts at the diner to pay for my own driver's ed. I didn't complain. I just worked. I spent my weekends wiping down sticky laminate tables and studying for AP classes in the break room while Cody was out celebrating victories I wasn't invited to share. My parents bragged about Cody's touchdowns to anyone who would listen at church, but my honor roll certificates and scholarship letters usually ended up buried under a stack of mail on the counter. I grew up believing in resilience and personal responsibility because I had no other choice. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, I would earn my freedom. There was only one person who actually saw me. Grandpa Arthur. He was my father's dad, a Korean War vet who ran the local hardware store and had hands permanently stained with oil and sawdust. He was a man who believed in keeping receipts both literally in his business and metaphorically in life. He was the only one who showed up to my community college graduation, sitting alone in the folding chairs while my parents took Cody on a college tour. After the ceremony, Grandpa Arthur took me to the diner, ordered us black coffee and pie, and looked me dead in the eye. "Your brother's used to being carried. He told me, his voice rough like gravel. "You know how to walk. Don't forget that, Gloria." He was the one who taught me to save every document, every email, every scrap of proof. "People will rewrite history if you let them," he'd say, tapping his temple. "Don't let them erase you." I loved him like a second father, the only father who really counted. When Grandpa Arthur died suddenly of a stroke last year, the grief nearly hollowed me out. But for my parents and Cody, the grief seemed to last only as long as it took to schedule the reading of the will. We gathered in the attorney's office a week after the funeral. The atmosphere was tense, greedy. The attorney read the bequest. Cody received the family house, a beautiful historic property Grandpa had owned for decades. Elaine and Victor received a massive lump sum from his savings. I sat there, hands folded, expecting nothing. Then the attorney cleared his throat. "And to Gloria," he read, "I leave the Lawson Opportunity Fund." My parents exchanged confused looks. They'd never heard of it. The attorney explained that Arthur had seeded the fund 25 years ago for whoever in the family works the hardest to build a life. It had been quietly compounding interest for decades. It was now worth $1.5 million. The silence in the room was absolute. My mother's face drained of color. Victor gripped the armrest of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Cody looked at me with pure, unadulterated betrayal. For 1 second, I thought maybe my parents would be happy for me, that they would see this as a validation of my hard work. I was wrong. That night, I went back to the house to pick up a box of books. The lights were low, and I heard voices drifting from the kitchen. I stopped in the hallway, the floorboards creaking softly under my weight. "We can't just let her run off with that kind of money," my mother whispered, her voice trembling with indignation. "She doesn't know how to handle it. It belongs to the family." "If she won't share," my father growled, "we'll make sure she doesn't get to keep it." I stood there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wasn't just the overlooked daughter anymore. I had become a target. That was the night I realized my parents would rather erase me than let me stand on my own. A week after the reading of the will, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. It was brief and commanded attendance. "We need to talk as a family. Saturday. No excuses." Despite the knot of dread tightening in my stomach, I went. I parked my rattling sedan in the driveway of my childhood home, took a deep breath, and walked inside, expecting a shouting match. What I found instead was far more sinister. My parents and Cody were seated around the dining room table, hands clasped, wearing expressions of practiced concern. But they weren't alone. A stranger sat at the head of the table, a man in a tailored charcoal suit, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Gloria, this is Martin Crane," my mother said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet warmth I hadn't heard in years. "He's our family attorney. He's here to help us navigate this transition." There was a pot of coffee on the table and a plate of pastries, a staged tableau of domestic peace. Martin slid a thick document across the mahogany surface toward me. The title was bold and insulting, "The Family Harmony Agreement." I didn't touch it. I just looked at him. "It's a standard arrangement," Martin explained, his tone smooth and patronizing. "This agreement transfers the Lawson Opportunity Fund into a centralized family-managed trust. You would receive a generous monthly allowance while your parents and brother responsibly invest and manage the principal for the good of the family." I felt the blood rush to my face. "An allowance?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I'm 27 years old." "We just don't want you to do something impulsive and ruin your life," Elaine said, leaning forward and placing a hand over mine. Her skin felt cold. "We've sacrificed so much for this family, Gloria. It's only right that we protect Grandpa's legacy together." Cody jumped in, his mouth full of a pastry he hadn't paid for. "Don't be selfish, Glo. Grandpa would want us to stick together. You don't know anything about investing. If you love this family, you'll sign." My father added, his voice dropping to a low rumble. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I pushed the document back across the table. I'm not signing away my life because you're scared of losing control. That money was left to me, specifically. The temperature in the room plummeted. Martin Crane's smile vanished, replaced by a cold professional mask. Ms. Lawson, if you refuse to sign, my clients are prepared to take alternative measures. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They will petition the court for a conservatorship. They will declare you financially incompetent to manage your own assets. We will file motions detailing your history of instability. I don't have a history of instability, I snapped. We can make it look like you do, my mother said softly. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to save you from yourself. Think about how embarrassing a public trial would be, Gloria. Everyone in town would know. If you walk out that door, Victor said, standing up to his full height, don't expect this family to stand by you. I looked at them, my mother's faux concern, my father's looming threat, my brother's entitled sneer. They would rather control me than support me. I grabbed my purse and walked out, shaking with rage, leaving the family harmony agreement unsigned on the table. 3 days later, the betrayal became official. A process server knocked on the door of my small apartment at 6 in the morning. He handed me a thick envelope and walked away without a word. I tore it open in my kitchen, my hands trembling. It was a petition for conservatorship, signed by Elaine Victor and Cody Lawson. As I read the allegations, bile rose in my throat. They accused me of reckless spending, citing a car repair bill I had struggled to pay as evidence of financial mismanagement. They claimed I exhibited erratic behavior and mental fragility, twisting moments of exhaustion from working double shifts into symptoms of a breakdown. They had attached cherry-picked text messages and old photos, stripping away the context to paint a picture of a woman unraveling. The real-world consequences hit 2 hours later. My supervisor at the community legal aid office, where I worked as an assistant manager, called me into her office. She wouldn't look me in the eye. We ran a standard public record update, Gloria. There's a pending petition regarding your competency. Until this is resolved, we have to place you on administrative leave. I walked out of the building with a box of my personal items, effectively unemployed. My ability to pay rent, my reputation, my stability. My parents were burning it all down just to get to that money. That evening, the isolation turned total. I opened Facebook to see a notification from Cody. He had posted a photo of himself with Grandpa Arthur, both of them smiling on the porch. The caption read, "Doing what we have to do to protect Grandpa's legacy from being wasted. Family first. Please pray for our sister in this difficult time." The comments were a landslide of judgment. Mutual friends, church members, and neighbors I had known my whole life were piling on. "Money changes people," Mrs. Gable wrote. "I always thought Gloria was ungrateful," added the deacon's wife. I watched the likes and comments stack up, feeling the entire community siding with my parents. With a few carefully chosen words, they were erasing my reality and replacing it with their lie. I sat on my floor, spiraling. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, suffocating. I almost called Martin Crane right then to tell him I'd sign. I just wanted it to stop. I wanted to give them half, give them all of it, just to end the siege. But then my eyes landed on the plastic storage bin in the corner of my closet. Grandpa Arthur's binder, the one he called his lifeline. I dragged the box out and flipped through the heavy binder, smelling the faint scent of stale tobacco and sawdust that still clung to the pages. I leafed through trust documents, bank statements, and notes he insisted I keep. In the middle of the binder, tucked between 2 dividers, I found a handwritten note on yellow legal paper. It was Arthur's jagged scrawl. "If anyone ever tries to take what's yours, read Section 9, subsection C. Trust, but verify. A.L." My heart hammered against my ribs. I frantically flipped through the dense legal text of the original trust document until I found it. Section 9, subsection C. I read the paragraph 3 times, my breath catching in my throat. It was a forfeiture clause. It stated in plain, undeniable English that any beneficiary who initiates legal action to deprive another beneficiary of their share automatically forfeits their own interest in the estate. I sat back against the wall, the document trembling in my hand. "Grandpa," I whispered into the empty room, "you knew." I wasn't just holding a defense anymore, I was holding a nuclear option. If my parents and Cody continued with this conservatorship, they wouldn't just lose control over me, they would lose everything Arthur had left them. I sat at my kitchen table until the sun began to bleed through the blinds, Section 9, subsection C, staring up at me like a loaded weapon. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago. I was paralyzed by the weight of the choice in front of me. If I enforced this clause, I wouldn't just be winning a lawsuit. I would be stripping my parents and my brother of their entire inheritance. I would be leaving them with nothing. But if I folded, if I let them bully me into submission, they would succeed in painting me as incompetent, taking my freedom and erasing the life I had built. I looked at the empty chair across from me, imagining Grandpa Arthur sitting there. He wouldn't want me to be a martyr. He gave me the tools to fight because he knew sooner or later I would need them. I took a deep breath, picked up a pen, and decided that if they wanted a war, they were going to get the whole truth. It was time to reveal the one thing my family had never bothered to ask about. While they were busy judging my cheap car and my job at the legal aid office, they had missed the bigger picture. For the past 4 years, I hadn't just been working. I had been attending law school at night. I wasn't a high-powered corporate shark, but I had passed the bar exam 3 months ago. I was a licensed attorney. I didn't need Martin Crane, and I certainly didn't need a guardian. I went to the courthouse the next morning and filed a counter-petition pro se representing myself. I invoked the forfeiture clause filed for a breach of fiduciary duty against the executors, my parents, and filed an emergency motion to freeze all trust distributions until the matter was resolved. The reaction was immediate. 2 days later, Martin Crane responded with a filing that made my blood run cold. He submitted a document labeled Trust Amendment, dated 3 years prior. It allegedly claimed that Arthur had decided to consolidate all assets into a family council, explicitly overriding the original terms of the Lawson Opportunity Fund. I stared at the PDF on my laptop screen. The language was all wrong, too flowery, too corporate. It didn't sound like the man who spoke in grunts and aphorisms. But it was the signature that made me pause. It looked perfect. Too perfect. I pulled out Grandpa's binder and placed his original trust documents next to the screen. I traced the curves of the A and the L. The signature on the amendment was identical to the one on his 1998 will, down to the microscopic tremor in the final loop. No one signs their name exactly the same way twice. I tapped into my savings money I could barely spare and hired a forensic document examiner. While he worked, I turned my attention to the notary seal on the amendment. The stamp belonged to a woman named Linda Halloway. I dug through the state archives and found her current address. She had retired to Florida 5 years ago. I called her, my heart pounding. When I described the document dated from 3 years ago, she laughed dryly. "Honey," she said, "I haven't stamped a paper since I moved to Boca in 2019, and I certainly didn't notarize anything for Victor Lawson." She emailed me a sworn affidavit within the hour, confirming the seal on the document was a forgery. The forensic report arrived the next day, confirming the rest. The signature on the amendment wasn't genuine. It was a digital composite traced from an older document. Even worse, the chemical analysis of the paper stock showed that the paper itself had been manufactured 6 months after the date Arthur had supposedly signed it. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. My parents and brother had committed felony fraud to steal my inheritance. The realization hit me with a physical force. I sat on my floor surrounded by papers, feeling a heartbreak so profound it made it hard to breathe. They didn't just want to control me. They were willing to fabricate my grandfather's last wishes to erase me from his legacy entirely. I needed to know why. Why go to such criminal lengths? I used the investigative skills I'd honed at the legal aid office to pull their financial records. The truth was ugly. Cody's successful startup that he bragged about constantly. It had dissolved months ago, buried under lawsuits and unpaid vendor judgments. My parents' house, the one they held over my head as a symbol of their stability, was in pre-foreclosure. They were 3 months behind on the mortgage. They had drained their retirement accounts. The numbers they needed to clear their debts almost exactly matched the value of my trust fund. I felt a twisted, dark sympathy for a fleeting moment. They were drowning. But instead of asking for a life raft, they tried to pull me under to save themselves. That sympathy evaporated when I remembered the conservatorship petition. They were willing to destroy my reputation and my autonomy to cover their own failures. The night before the hearing, I sat in my apartment with 3 color-coded folders spread out on the table. The red folder held the trust and the forfeiture clause. The blue folder held the notary affidavit and the forensic report proving the forgery. The black folder held the public records of their financial ruin, the motive. I placed my bar admission certificate carefully into my briefcase. I looked at the photo of Grandpa Arthur on my shelf. Tomorrow, I promised him, I stop letting them threaten my future. Tomorrow we keep the receipts. I closed the briefcase. I was ready. The heavy oak door swung shut behind me, sealing us in. We were back where we started, but the air in the room had shifted. It was heavier now, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I noticed things I hadn't before: the scuffed black marks on the linoleum tile near the defense table, the low, irritating hum of a dying fluorescent light overhead. Cody was slouched in his chair, aggressively scrolling on his phone, looking bored. Elaine had her hand on Victor's forearm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket. They looked like royalty waiting to be crowned. They had no idea the guillotine was already rigged. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed, his voice bouncing off the high ceiling. Judge Marion Porter swept in. She was an older woman with steel gray hair and eyes that looked like they could cut glass. She took the bench, adjusted her glasses, and picked up the docket file. In the matter of the conservatorship of Gloria Lawson, she read, her voice flat and authoritative. She looked down at me, standing alone at my table with my battered briefcase. "Ms. Lawson, I see you have filed a counter-petition. Are you expecting counsel, or is your attorney running late?" I stood up, smoothing the front of my $12 jacket. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm breaks. "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. "Gloria Lawson, appearing as counsel for myself. I was admitted to the state bar last year." The silence that followed was absolute. It sucked the oxygen right out of the room. I heard a sharp intake of breath from my mother. Cody stopped scrolling. His phone clattered onto the table. Martin Crane, their high-priced shark, stiffened in his chair, his posture shifting from relaxed arrogance to sudden alertness. They stared at me, the waitress, the quiet one, the failure, and realized for the first time that they didn't know me at all. Judge Porter raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest crossing her face. "Is that so? Very well, Ms. Lawson. Proceed." I didn't waste a second. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the red folder. "Your Honor, before we address the petitioner's baseless claims regarding my competency, I would like to direct the court's attention to the original trust instrument established by Arthur Lawson, specifically Exhibit A, Section 9, Subsection C." I walked the document up to the bench, feeling my parents' eyes burning holes in my back. I turned to face the room and explained the clause in a clear, narrative voice. "This forfeiture clause states that any beneficiary who initiates legal action to deprive another beneficiary of their share or to alter the administration of the trust against the grantor's wishes automatically forfeits their own interest in the estate." Judge Porter read the clause, then looked over her glasses at Martin Crane. "Mr. Crane, were you aware of this provision when you filed this petition?" Martin stood up, stammering, his slick demeanor evaporating. "Your Honor, my clients they were merely concerned about the respondent's capacity. This was an act of protection, not deprivation." "Concern does not justify concealment," the judge snapped. Her demeanor hardened. "But I assume Ms. Lawson has more—" "I do, Your Honor." I pulled out the blue folder. Exhibit B is the amendment submitted by the petitioners allegedly signed by Arthur Lawson 3 years ago. Exhibit C is an affidavit from the notary public whose seal appears on that document, along with a forensic report analyzing the paper stock and signature. I walked the judge through the evidence step by step, methodically dismantling their lie. I showed her the mismatched seal. I showed her the report proving the paper was manufactured after the date of the signature. I showed her the digital tracing artifacts. It wasn't an argument, it was an autopsy. Judge Porter turned her gaze to my parents. It was a withering look. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson," she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, "can you explain how a forged amendment ended up attached to your petition?" Elaine burst into tears. It was a theatrical, desperate sobbing. "We were just trying to protect the family," she wailed, clutching a tissue. "We didn't want the money to ruin her." Victor remained stone-faced, staring straight ahead, unable to look at the daughter who had just outmaneuvered him. Cody looked trapped, his eyes darting between his parents and the exit. The verdict came swiftly. Judge Porter didn't just dismiss the petition for conservatorship, she dismissed it with prejudice. Then she dropped the hammer. She enforced the forfeiture clause. Elaine Victor and Cody Lawson are hereby stripped of all beneficial interest in the Arthur Lawson Trust, she ruled. She imposed monetary sanctions for the frivolous filing and ordered that the forged amendment be referred to the district attorney's office for review. I stood there as the gavel banged a hollow wooden sound that signaled the end of my life as a Lawson. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I felt numb. I felt like someone had just called the time of death on what was left of my family. In the hallway afterward, the silence was agonizing. Elaine lunged for me, grabbing my arm with a desperate strength. "Gloria, please," she begged, her mascara running. "We can fix this. We're your parents. We sacrificed everything for you." I pulled my arm away, stepping back. "You sacrificed me," I said, my voice cold. "Not for me." Victor finally looked at me, his face twisted with hate. "You destroyed this family," he spat. He ignored the fact that he was the one who fired the first shot. He only cared that I had returned fire. Cody wouldn't meet my eyes. He just muttered, "You could have just shared glow," still unable to see past his own entitlement. I turned my back on them, leaving them standing in the fluorescent-lit corridor, and pushed through the heavy doors into the blinding afternoon sun. As I walked down the courthouse steps, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated email from the trust administrator. The forfeiture clause had triggered Arthur's secondary instructions. The trust was being reorganized, and the money wasn't going where anyone expected. It has been 6 months since I walked out of that courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun, and the landscape of my life has changed entirely. The dust has finally settled, but it landed in a pattern no one, least of all my family, could have predicted. When Judge Porter enforced the forfeiture clause, she didn't just strip my parents and Cody of their shares. She triggered a secondary provision in Grandpa Arthur's trust that I hadn't even known existed. The millions that would have gone to them didn't come to me. Instead, they were automatically rerouted into a new charitable entity. The Arthur Lawson Grit Scholarship, dedicated exclusively to first-generation college students in our county. It was Grandpa's final silent laugh. He ensured that if his family couldn't appreciate the value of hard work, his money would go to strangers who did. I used a portion of my own share to pay off every cent of my student loans and the credit card debt I'd racked up paying for bar exam prep. I bought a modest 2-bedroom condo 3 blocks from the courthouse, a place with squeaky floors that belong only to me. I also put seed money into a small solo practice. I don't handle corporate mergers. I specialize in estate disputes and elder protection. I help people who are being erased by the very people supposed to protect them. The consequences for the rest of the Lawsons were less redeeming. Cody declared bankruptcy 3 months ago. His startup lifestyle collapsed the moment the safety net was cut. Last I heard, he was working warehouse shifts at a distribution center on the edge of town. My parents sold the family home just weeks before the bank would have foreclosed. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom rental complex near the highway. The district attorney ultimately declined to press criminal charges for the forgery, citing the family dynamic and the restitution already paid through the civil sanctions, but the finding of fraud is a matter of public record. It is a permanent stain they can't wash out. The town of Harmony Creek has had a harder time adjusting to the new reality. The same neighbors who posted nasty comments on Facebook about how money changes people now avoid making eye contact with me at the grocery store. A few have tried to slide back into my good graces, especially after the local paper ran a front-page story on the new scholarship fund. They smile tight, fake smiles and say things like, "We always knew you were special, Gloria." I stay polite, but I keep my distance. People love a clean story, the selfish daughter versus the noble parents. But real life is messier, and I kept the receipts. I know exactly who stood by me and who didn't. My contact with my family is now strictly defined by boundaries as rigid as a prison wall. I went low contact immediately. No surprise visits, no Sunday dinners, just brief factual emails regarding essential administrative matters. Last month, Elaine sent me a long, rambling email at 2 in the morning. She wrote, "I'm sorry things got so complicated. We just wanted to protect you. We're still your parents. Family is forever." I read it twice, looking for an actual apology, an admission of the forgery, or the betrayal. There was nothing, just self-pity and manipulation. I replied with 2 sentences, "I hope you find peace. I'm building mine." Cody texted me a week later asking to meet for coffee, to talk like siblings again. Part of me wanted to say yes. Part of me missed the brother I thought I had when we were kids. But then I remembered the smirk on his face in the courtroom, the way he let our parents try to destroy my reputation just so he could keep his inheritance. I texted back, "Not yet, maybe someday, but I need to feel safe first." I haven't heard from him since. My healing comes from the work. Last week I sat with an elderly widow whose children were pressuring her to sign over the deed to her house. I held her hand, looked her in the eye, and told her exactly what Grandpa Arthur told me. "You know how to walk." We built a trust that protected her assets and her dignity. But the real catharsis came at the first annual scholarship ceremony. 5 students stood on the stage, all of them working night shifts, all of them looking tired but hopeful. One young woman came up to me afterward, tears in her eyes, and shook my hand. "Because of this," she told me, "I don't have to choose between rent and textbooks this semester." I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had in years. Arthur's money wasn't just saving me, it was lifting up the community. Back in my condo, I sat at my desk where I keep a small shadow box. Inside are 3 things: a copy of the forfeiture clause, my bar association card, and the flyer for the scholarship. I looked at the framed photo of Grandpa Arthur next to it. I realized then that I had lost the illusion of loving parents who would always choose me. That grief is real, and it still hurts. But I gained something they could never give me myself. I gained the resilience to stand alone, the freedom to choose my own path, and the knowledge that I can survive the fire. Sometimes the people who say family is everything are the ones most willing to erase you when you stop obeying. If you were me, if your own parents ambushed you in court, forged documents, and tried to steal your future just to save their own skins, would you forgive and fold, or would you stand your ground and live with the silence? I turned off the office light, leaving the room in darkness, except for the glow of a small brass plaque on my shelf. Lawson Grit Scholarship Fund, in honor of Arthur Lawson, who always kept the receipts. And that is how Gloria Lawson finally closed the painful chapter of her past, forging a future not built on resentment, but on grit and resilience. If you found yourself rooting for Gloria, hit that like button and let us know in the comments below. Would you have enforced the forfeiture clause? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.